Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is, yet again, Mr. Adam Winston. Adam, good to have you back again.
Thanks. I feel like it's good. I beat Corey back from Europe, so I think that's why I got this spot, but I'll take it. I have faster flights.
That's partially that, and also partially I feel like we had some unfinished business from our last episode a couple weeks back talking about AI. So that's why on today's episode brought you back so that we can finish up what we were chatting about and learn more about what attackers and defenders are using AI for and what some of the future holds for us. So with that, let's go ahead and, generate our way in.
Sure.
So Adam, I guess last time we talked, we were focusing mostly on like how artificial intelligence is being used to automate the SOC, both historically over the last couple of decades and a bit of forward thinking. We went into a few like specifics on some of the major benefits of AI, some of the current limitations, how they might be resolved. But some areas we didn't hit on are like really getting into the weeds on some actual applications of artificial intelligence from both the attacker perspective specifically, but then even some more on defender side and maybe some like chats about regulations coming down the pipeline too. But I figure let's get started with like, in my opinion, the really interesting stuff. And I know you've been, not directly involved, at least in conducting some of these incidents, but at least like aware of what's been going on in the AI space. And I wanted to start like, what are some examples of like how attackers are using artificial intelligence right now?
Yeah, I think the one that grabs the most headlines are the deep fakes that I think most people haven't dug into necessarily how that's happening. And I think if you look specifically, what's interesting about those stories, and I'm referencing the one that everybody mentions about multiple people from the organization had impersonated different, existing staff and had conned, 25 million pounds, I think was refunded in the end. But it's certainly grabbing the headlines because it's one of the first examples of a conference call like this one having a deepfake, actor with voice video that convinced an actual human to, send money the wrong way. And I think that most people sort of misunderstand, or at least haven't maybe, looked at the tools that can do this for them, right? And so there are some models that you can look at to do this yourself, right? There's, some product like Anthropify that basically take a static image of your likeness and then it will allow you to animate it. So it'll kind of like wear it like a mask, if you will. And the idea is that that's a pretty simple tool on Windows to download that will basically overlay to your video feed. So even as I connect to, StreamYard or Zoom or Teams or whatever today, right? The idea is that it's piping through my camera. But we're all familiar with the Zoom backgrounds and the ways that you can kind of create filters or additions, overlays to the existing, video that you have, right? And so that there's, of course, for the video portion of this, a very simple way to take a static image of you from LinkedIn or from the internet in your home or somewhere. Maybe you upload this podcast and then someone can take a screenshot of it and then impersonate at least my mannerisms. And as you know, from kind of humans on video here, you don't have to animate much but the face, right? You're not really doing a lot to kind of do this complex thing that AI has a hard time doing with hands or arms or other types of motions. And if you want to see AI struggle with this, try to generate a Sora video of a gymnast doing a routine, and all of a sudden there's 6 arms, 5 legs, and other things, because the models aren't that good at doing that. Right?
I've seen that one.
Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous. But part of it is that in order for this success to happen in the deepfake world, you basically just need an image of somebody. Now, the other thing they can do, which I'm also doing here with this mic, is that I'm virtualizing the hardware that's coming into this stream, right? So the idea is that if you had a voice mod, which could capture, in some cases, a few minutes, right? So there's voice mod is the name of an actual, technology or software that can do this, where you'll encode, certain things like people talking for a few minutes, and then they can basically intonate the cadence of what they're doing, right? The most dramatic, expansive models that do this are things like Udio or other, music services that will emulate likeness to an artist or create these kind of musical sounds. So, the technology is catching up really, really quickly to make it very, very difficult. And anybody that's seen the new I think they're called Neo video models from the new version of Google, we'll have a really hard time looking at that video, which does audio and video in one, and not see those videos as very, very difficult to spot the edges and then pick out the threat actor. So that one's got a lot of press. And I feel like underneath the covers, people don't understand just how simple it is for anybody to pull this off. And so for people watching the podcast that are like, hey, I want to deep fake my friends or voice mod my friends, those are tools that you can use on the internet right now that are open source. You can even work on the models yourself to enhance them. So that's a big flagship one, is this kind of story of deepfakes, because people are worried that it's going to get worse and worse and worse, especially as we conduct a lot of business online and frankly through meetings like this, that the authenticity of these types of meetings is going to be difficult to handle. But that's only one big story, and I wouldn't say it was a successful story, right? This is not a trend that we necessarily need to keep our finger on right now. There's no actions for the SOC to take. There's no tools for people really to buy. We're still kind of doing awareness campaigns around like wire transfer, best practices and stuff like that to avoid this type of thing from becoming a problem. But across the board, yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's super interesting because you can see just how quickly all the tools have evolved even in just the last 3 years. Like this technology, it's not new. Like we've had Snapchat filters for like a decade now, it feels like. And while those used to just make you look like you put on too much makeup, now we've got ones that can turn you into like a cantaloupe, for example. But like even it was 3-4 years ago when like Will Smith eating spaghetti was like a deepfake video that made its way around. You could still tell that like something was off. There's still a bit of that weird kind of uncanny valley like quality to it, but the technology is getting better. Especially like doing it live is still difficult, and I think that's where the kind of final frontier for this is. But like looking at pre-recorded stuff, like the technology feels like it is just about already there. Like I've got a $5 a month subscription to 11 Labs, and I can reliably create a model for like anyone's voice now with like a couple minutes of just audio recordings. Like I've got a great model of Corey right now from all of the podcast talking that he's had. I guess I got to create one for you too now, Adam, now that I've had you on here for a bit.
I've been at least an hour on this thing, so you got it.
And like $5 a month, and you can get a very accurate audio recording. And in the video recording stuff, like taking a static image and turning it into a human it's totally doable now. And that technology is only going to improve. And like that story that you were talking about with the finance employees that ended up wiring like tens of millions of bucks away, even after hopping on a video call, that one scared the crap out of me enough as just like a wake up call that maybe we're not like right there, but it's imminent and we need to prepare for it. So like the one action that like our SOC took alongside like our service desk team was just revisiting how we validate that like the employee that we're talking to is actually that employee for risky actions. Like if you call up tomorrow and say, hey, I need help resetting my password, or I locked myself out of my authenticator and need a new one registered to my account. Like historically, we would hop on a Teams call with you, maybe ask like a question off of your like HR profile or something, and that was enough. But now like I can't trust that it's actually going to be you on that video call. And so we've had to update our own internal mechanisms to account for that we can't always trust an audio or a video call anymore. So I think that is an action that people can at least start considering or planning to take, because it does feel like we're getting close enough that it's uncomfortable to these being like an actual real threat. But sorry, I'll let you go ahead and continue.
Well, I mean, you look at that and say, like, why was there implicit trust? Right? Did it really take that one reference? And I mean, I wouldn't say that this is a rampant thing is deepfake social engineering. There's obviously a bunch of like scams where you'd see, public figures or intellectuals, promote products with their likeness that are fake, and it's kind of giving investment advice or something like that with a prominent, investment banker. There's stuff like that kind of circulating social media, but those scams aren't the kind of scams that your SOC team can really kind of prevent around. That's like extraterritorial hunting. You got to get out of the infrastructure, get out of the data set that you are there to protect, and go try to chase those things down for those people, right? And like take down sites and all this other stuff. Like it's a very difficult thing to kind of go outside the walls. But when you look at, why there was that implicit trust, there wasn't a lot of references, right? We almost always in cybersecurity have to have a significant amount of precedent to act, right? And so if there's really only this one case, I think even though it freaked us out as a security company, a lot of people aren't taking a lot of, actions to like, password protect their meetings or set up a second factor with people to be like, hey, what's the PIN for the company that this employee needs to know when we go to do these resets, right? If you think about your banking information, use your PIN on, a debit card. You even have that CVV code you enter now with your credit card in most cases. So there's this idea that there's like another factor, another piece of information. They take these additional steps to try to put something that's really hard to fake, which is what what's in your head. And when we haven't had that with video, it's not like when I joined this call, you said, Adam, what's the Adam pin, right? But we may very quickly get to that state where we can no longer trust the fact that I was able to get this link and jump on, right? There was no other passcode protecting the meeting. But even if there was, right, you probably still need another piece of validation, which is, a secret code for myself. So, New England clam chowder is coming to knock on the door. Is it the red or the white? We're going to have to know in order to avoid these attacks. And of course, there's a number of other things that I think they're trying to do in the community to establish trust, which is to detect deep fakes, right? And, very similar to the way they tag phishing emails with like external, or they tag them with like potential spam and things like that. If there is AI recognition from the streaming to say like, look, the way these packets are coming across looks like there's an overlay over this person's face, right? And, that might disrupt people that are using it to get rid of wrinkles or touch themselves up on Zoom or whatever. But obviously, your facial fingerprint, other identifiers that they might be able to tell as an overlay is the other kind of suggested additional software or tooling that they're pushing to stop this. But again, this is not something that if I'm sitting there worried about what the SOC's up to, it's not necessarily this use case. This is just a popular one, right?
And for like a poor man's detection capability there, just for maybe only for the next year or so until technologies improve, if you do suspect that someone is AI, or at least being like AI modified, ask them to like move their hand in front of their face like this, like open palm back and forth. That really screws up like every single engine that I've seen so far.
Yeah, as soon as the hands, it's like art, right? It's really hard to draw hands, it's really hard to sculpt hands. That's why they always kind of look at those as really good artists. But same thing, right? The hands are really difficult for even the AI to do. And they used to say, turn your head, right? There used to be this basic thing about like the mask would stop because most people don't have a three-dimensional shot of your head. So it would kind of like release the blonde hair or whatever would be, behind the mask, right? But the concept is that, I mean, these tools are getting better and better and better. They can infer the likeness 360, I'm sure, in the days that come. And of course, you saw with the new models from Google, just how good people's, hands, legs, arms, audio is. It's very, very difficult. So I'd say that, we're a couple months from even those tools being away. Maybe the New England clam chowder concept here, the passcode, that's something could be another way to thwart this. And of course, layers to these apps to say, hey, is there going to be a secure video, something more authentic that comes out of it? But this is one that everybody likes to talk about. I don't think it's probably, in terms of volume or risk, the highest. Like on a risk-adjusted basis, is this the biggest problem that we have? No, right? I'd say that, when you look at threat actors, what they're using in terms of AI augmentation, right? The phishing is probably the single greatest enhancement to the social engineering, right? Those emails, right? You look at the basics of like some of the campaigns that work. There's the concept of like, putting a display name that's different than a long URL that makes no sense. And those usually get kind of truncated on your phone. So it kind of looks like it's coming from Mark, but it's really just the display name Mark, and the rest of that very easy to spot domain is as fake is not showing up on your phone. But the phone's also a really bad place to phish somebody, right? Because single user space and all that other stuff, right? That the apps run their own memory. So you're not really going to be able to steal a lot that way. But what you get is, sometimes these emails where you're just doing sort of a reply on behalf of or something like that, where it can still look like no reply from Microsoft, even though you're just changing the header. And then they use, AI to basically replicate very good language, very good facsimiles of the, typical Microsoft invoice or AWS invoice or something else that gets you to click through to that, third-party domain where they're hoping to scoop your credentials or your cookies and get into your account, right? So, you look at that as a form of AI. Where's the AI, right? It's in the generative algorithms they use on the language. It's in their ability to, maybe dynamically create different things that show up. And that's what's happening on email. That's probably the single greatest kind of impact we've had so far to the SOC, mostly because the click-through rate jumps as high as 50%, right? You got a good phishing email campaign, security awareness campaign, you're probably floating somewhere between 10 and 15% click-through for your users if you run it once a month and you're using those good emails to train them. But on the flip side of that, if you can jump that rate to 50%, I mean, you don't have to send hundreds of millions of spam messages now. You can send very, very crafty ones from SendGrid or other things like that you can put more money into the infrastructure, basically.
And I think one of the other big areas of that is like all that used to still be possible. Like you could go create a very well written email and get like a higher click rate on it, but it was entirely manual of really maybe templatized in some cases, but still like the pre-texting, creating the email, handling the interaction was all effectively manual. And now a lot of that, almost all of that, can be just totally automated with AI too.
And the recon part, right? Like if you look at the fact that like, the phishing email, anybody can create a good phishing email, but part of that click-through rate is not just targeting en masse everybody at the company, because we very quickly go, did you get this email? Did you get this email? Right? Like there's this herd mentality to safeguarding things that I think people just naturally do. And obviously to look at the reconnaissance of this, you want to know with context how to trick the user, right? So a lot of the LinkedIn scraping, a lot of the sort of, looking at GitHub for, a project somebody might be working on that allows you to say, okay, well, if I get this IT admin or I get this kind of developer over here to kind of give me the AWS keys or something like that, I can use G2 Crowd or something. You can use a lot of the AI to automate the process of saying like, okay, look at the resumes on LinkedIn, find out what software these guys are using, look at the people that are doing commits to GitHub, target those folks, right? So that you have a very, very special email that looks a lot more like, hey, you know what? It's Jeff. I'm over here trying to, pump some stuff in from the Golang to the Git repo. I see that, you're working on it. Has the API key changed from this? And then they can, flip back something, right? So the idea is that when it goes to the recon or the intelligence gathering side, there's certainly a lot of things that AI can do to do that automation that we're starting to see, reference to. And this is, I mean, we really got to prosecute this. Say like, okay, well, what are the examples, right? Where can you get data like this that says that, people are actually doing this kind of thing? And I think there's no greater place to look than at our own government and say, well, okay, well, how do we get into foreign nation states, right? We usually buy 0 days, right? If you don't know, the vulnerability equity program, for people who haven't heard about it, is the idea that when the NSA or somebody discovers a 0 day, they decide in a consortium whether to use it as a weapon or to advise everybody, let it go to the wild, right? And they have this kind of repo of 0 days. And you can, there's companies like Zerodium and other things like that. You go to, their website, they sell these exploits to the government, right? A 0 day for Windows can cost $2 million. And those teams, the people that are generating those 0 days, they're using, right, artificial intelligence to find the vulnerabilities. They're using these models to find the vulnerabilities in the software to kind of build these dynamic tools that can go and do this recon and, weaponize these things a little bit better. And then they're for sale, right? So, the idea is that when you think about the attack teams, you just imagine this sort of poor, lowly attacker. And when you think about Conti, they have an HR team, right? Like there's the concept that these people are not, tooled like an organization, or that there aren't organizations like the ones like Zerodium building these 0 days that are using AI to develop this stuff. And then it ends up in the wild. And a great example, I mean, Stuxnet is a great example in 17. Eternal Blue, probably the biggest example of like, okay, when you hoard these vulnerabilities that might be developed in, for nation states that are supposed to be good, like ours, right? Are you really, worried that it's going to get out to the wild? And Eternal Blue is the greatest example of that leak turning into WannaCry and, not Petya, variants that took advantage of the SMB vulnerability that they were holding on to.
And like insanely damaging for private organizations around the world too, when that did happen.
Sure, it was a big surprise. I mean, a lot of people called me pretty surprised that this ransomware was shutting down, and it was a fluke that it shut down in the first place, right? It just kind of cascaded through everything, and we kind of got lucky that it didn't take everything out. But you look at those kinds of disclosures and say, well, okay, what are adversaries doing? Adversaries are buying 0 days. The governments are buying 0 days. Those things are leaking into the wild, and they become the single biggest cyber threats that we have. And those teams are certainly tooled. If you're paying a couple $1 million for a vulnerability, you certainly have, the option to take, your large language model and investigate static source code to find more vulnerabilities for yourself, because it's your job, right? On top of that, you also look at, the polymorphism, right? This is in the dropper use case, right? So if you look at Black Mamba, not to be confused with Black Basta, right? Black Mamba is an open source utility, supposed to be there for research purposes. But the idea is that they developed a keylogger that would automatically go to Chat GPT or OpenAI through the API and dynamically create the code in memory for how to generate that keylogger, right? And so you look at like, the adversary or the techniques or the tactics, and you say, okay, well, if we're going to borrow from the government, one of the greatest research institutions that is out there buying, 0 days, if we're going to look at these researchers that are doing things with AI, this is what they're doing, right? And if you look at the way that we do analysis on the endpoint and say, look, we eventually, and we'll talk about this when we talk about what we do on the good side, is the idea that we have to bring these models down to size to run on the endpoint. And that usually means they're not as good as the one in the cloud, right? And so if you use polymorphic tools to dynamically generate a keylogger that's new on the endpoint, it's probably going to have a greater success rate against EDRs, right? Especially ones that are relying on signatures or headers or other things in the portable executable. So the idea is that these tools are enriching the source code. They're also able to do more polymorphic things. The social engineering is getting a lot better, and we got to keep up, right? There's this concept of saying, okay, well, how are we going to deal with the deepfakes if that becomes a really big problem? How are we dealing with it on the endpoint if it's already a polymorphic nightmare? How are we dealing with it on filters, right? Am I looking for hasty messages with a machine learning anti-phishing algorithm that says, okay, well, no matter how this is constructed, you're usually going to use the same urgency in the message, the same sort of tactics to try to get people to send us information. So you got to get better at natural language processing because they got better at natural language processing. And we can't really rely on the user. And I never thought that we could rely on the user, frankly. At a 10% click rate, that was bad enough for us. But that we believe you're in a detection and response necessity at that point. If it's 50%, it's kind of like, okay, well, you can't rely on any of these filters then because the things are just going to start detonating.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, of all the things you just talked about, like, what do you think is the one that folks should be focusing on the most? Like, at least in the near term horizon, like, which one's going to introduce the most risk if left unaddressed?
Well, I think certainly if you look at polymorphic malware and the idea that you could own a lot of the workstations or workloads that we depend on to store our data, process our daily lives here, I think that presents one of the single greatest risks because it's the easiest way to monetize, right? If I look backwards from like where are the attackers going to focus their energy, I mean, you look at North Korea funding themselves with a lot of this black market cash that they're capturing through these campaigns. You look at the value of these coins, Bitcoins, right? We're up to multi-trillion dollars in terms of value for the way that they're being compensated. And I say, well, what's the number one way that they've been, other than stealing Bitcoin, because that's really successful? What's the number one way they're threatening us? And it's still to hijack data, and it's still to run encryptors on our workloads, right? And so left unchecked, unless we have a really good answer for the most polymorphic example, the most behavioral, conceptual design around the endpoint and the other tools, the network and the identity, unchecked, that kind of like mass scale 0-day creation will put us way back. We'll be kind of in 27 days where it felt like everybody was getting hit every month or every week even in terms of ransomware, right? And maybe it's a data exfil case, it's a different kind of extortion, but that unchecked is a big problem. I don't think the deepfake thing presents as big a risk because there are simple workarounds to that problem, right? There are simple ways to say, let's get to the human CAPTCHA before we start a conversation, right? And that's been protocol for very sensitive communications for a very long time, right? So, you'll probably have a secure messaging app. Those things will level up. And I don't think that's necessarily our responsibility. But left unchecked, the vulnerability thing can really create some problems for us.
Yeah, I hear you on that. And you already mentioned, so like on the defender side with AI usage, like what are some applications you're seeing there, like getting in the weeds on where we're starting to leverage that, and maybe some of the forward-thinking stuff to help protect against some of these modern techniques you're seeing?
Yeah, current state, you definitely need machine learning as the algorithm to identify behavior, right? That there's just no question about it. It's got the most, powerful capabilities at identifying behaviors, which gets around the idea that they keep finding different ways to do the same thing, right? You're going to encrypt through this process or that memory exploit or this, aspect of the operating system. You're still really just encrypting, files, right? So if there is something to to study, right? For many years, let's talk about the endpoint first, right? You have this concept of labeling benign and malware that's been going on with machine learning in the cloud. And then just like you had distillation, and people blame, DeepSeek for, distilling the OpenAI models. Distillation, it's the idea that you need to make the big model small to fit it on the endpoint, right? The cloud can do a lot of things with its huge compute. It can look at a lot of features or variables in terms of identifying things. But you have to take those features away to be like, which things have the highest weights, which things are the most common predictors of malware, and then bring down the model to the level where it can run on, your workstation without crashing or running all the CPU, right?
And that's actually like a big challenge right now with a lot of these models. Like you can go and get like, what is Facebook's Llama or whatever, and you can run that offline on your machine, but it actually takes a decent amount of resources to mirror the capabilities that you have through like the hosted version they have.
Yeah, I mean, you look at a model like Llama, right? What's it intended to do, right? It's got a lot of things that it can derive, whether it's source code, et cetera. So, you want a model that's obviously purpose-built for this, so that it's lean in the first place. And then it's got to fit into, I think, what we afford on the endpoint is probably what we afford in cyber as a budget. It's like 1 to 5% CPU at the max, right? If this thing starts to bleed over to 10%, if I start to see apps slow down, I'm seeing the downsides of malware from the solution, right? So like the solution can also cause the problem. And I think that obviously you're right. Just, taking a general model like that is very difficult. So as my advice to people that are out there saying, hey, I want to develop an endpoint or even a network firewall ability to create these models, they have to be purpose-driven to the telemetry that you're talking about. The Llama's trained on a pretty significant data set, right? And so when you look at, the malware design, right, you probably have a couple hundred different variables, right? The file size, the functions it uses, things like the header information, what libraries it calls, all those other things that when you start to put them through machine learning and put them against the malware, and you start to have it derive, which one of these features, which one of these variables are important at determining malware. Is it the size, the calls to this mem dump, to this particular, process or command line or something like that? Does it make calls to APIs, right? All those things will start to be, how you sort of flatten this out, because it wasn't looking at too much to begin with. And then it gets on the endpoint, you can probably squeeze it in, as we found, on 1 to 5% CPU. And then the same is true. You look at the firewall, the exact same thing's true, right? You're not going to necessarily be able to take an ASIC-based firewall or field programmable logic array or something like that and say, look, here's this very purpose-driven, super high-performance data plane, and we're going to do UTM or threat prevention directly on it or app ID on it. We're going to be able to look at the payloads and take all this other massive amount of compute to do machine learning on the device. No, you have to take those pieces of telemetry, you put them up into the cloud, you decide that you want to determine the difference between Skype and BitTorrent, like we talked about on the last podcast. You're going to have to look at very specific things that you can get at layer 4, right? Bite size, frequency of messaging. You're going to, like Zoom, you're going to have a very consistent number of packets. You're not going to have bursts like BitTorrent. So you use those very small, very predictable ways that you can then flatten to say, hey, in 3 packets, you can decide whether or not to drop this thing or decide that it classifies itself as this application or not, right? And a lot of things are frankly like that. Even identity, you go from the endpoint to the network to the cloud and try to protect things with an identity product. It's the same thing. How do you determine somebody didn't steal your session cookie and walk over to the next, machine and use it, right? Well, the behaviors are usually going to be a very tight piece of telemetry that you're going to want for that anomaly detection, right? What's the user agent? What's the IP address? What's the geo based on that enrichment, right? So you say, okay, well, somebody stole my cookie, but they logged in from Thailand on a Windows machine with Chrome, as opposed to I use Mac in Safari. So those very simple ways are how these machine learning algorithms can take a whole bunch of things to be like, hey, these activities done in this quick succession with this little bit of telemetry, something we can fit into a very simple, very quick autonomous action that goes and kicks off a response.
I'm curious, are there any pieces of the security stack that you're hoping we find a good use of AI for that maybe just isn't there right now? Or maybe an area where, you're starting to see some people try and throw the AI buzzword around, but it's just not quite sticking yet?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at how innovation has worked in cybersecurity products, the ones that were the most successful, the companies that are the largest and have the largest revenue share, they've been innovating on a very narrow cone, right? We've been looking at ways to detect, hybrid IP. We're no different, right? We know we have to block things at the endpoint. We know we have to block them at the network. We know we have identity to protect third-party products, and those are the control points. So that's where we invest a lot of the detection and response, and we're going to have to continue to do that because they're going to get better at gaming it. But then if you look at things that haven't been innovated on, like the password, right? Or the idea that you might have a unified approach to biometric authentication, where everything from your keystrokes to, your likeness to, the cadence by which you do things during the day are all real-time evaluated by, an AI algorithm to determine whether you're authentically you, and using other tools, let's say like a blockchain, to start storing, an immutable version of that, capability, right? Those are all things that are out there. And you just don't see an appetite to use those innovations in that space. And I feel like, we kind of only recently, like you look at Microsoft mandating MFA or the adoption rate of people putting in a little bit more conditional access or something like that. They're very slow to move on these adoption rates, right? They'll drop an endpoint with AI in it and go, as long as it doesn't break anything, run it across my entire stack. But they won't bother the user with the user experience to go into those more sophisticated forms of authentication. And so whether it was Windows Hello, whether it's the biometric auth you do on your phone with Face ID, whether it's a unified approach that synchronizes all those things to kind of do a real-time analysis of this, such a great application of artificial intelligence and zero adoption. I can't even think of a company, even though there are tools that exist. Some of them are our customers, these early stage startups that had won competitions at the RSA conference and are doing these real-time biometric analyses and using machine learning. And the adoption rate's so low, right? When you think about across the board. So that's definitely a place I feel like we could be innovating that we're not. And and the other one is obviously data classification, right? You look at the adversary has capabilities to pre-train models to find sensitive data on file systems, so that when they go deploy, and BlackBast is Alpha V, they're great at this, right? You have very, very lean, tools that are there to encrypt an entire, data set, but they prioritize so efficiently. They know the database, they know the files, they know the stuff that is going to make you squeal, right? And so, if they can do it, right, if they can classify the data, why aren't we, right? Like I look at like the policies in 365, and it's still the old folder permissions, read, write, execute, create a share. Is it for the whole company? Is it for this person outside the org? And who cares what the data is? The very low adoption of data loss, despite having incredible natural language processing to index the files that are very sensitive to us. And frankly, using the same tools that we used on the endpoint to find malware, right? How do you identify very highly used, very sensitive, very important information? Activity, right? Like the idea that we're going to have a last access to the file, the same stuff that Alpha V is looking at to find the sensitive data and hold, a big company like MGM hostage. We could use the same. We could learn from our enemies here. And so I feel like, biometric authentication, certainly data loss and classification. We just don't seem to be innovating there, despite having this massive amount of core technology that's been innovated on in the last 12 months. So I'm anxious and hopeful that we're going to start to see stuff there, because that'll really start to actually move things up a notch from these typical living off the land, steal your data, embarrass you, without us having to innovate so badly that there's just no exploit, no living off the land, no behavior that we can use to detect and block something. You can kind of start protecting yourself by default.
I feel like the data classification point's a very good example, because that is a extremely difficult process to like do thoroughly, especially in like smaller organizations that just don't have the maturity, or maybe don't have even the funding to get like the right tools to even facilitate that kind of thing. So that's a very interesting use case. I'm thinking in my head, like the hot take, maybe we just need like a dry run mode for some ransomware variant, run that, see what it would have touched, and then go ahead and throw a critical label on anything there. But
you're right. They overcharge. If you look at file analysis as a product category, right? People kind of conflate, security information or syslog or logs, and aggregating that with, scanning your file system to look for either sensitive data or permissions or excess permissions and all that other stuff. And the create, read, update, delete audit that typically isn't done by syslog, or at least not in the cloud, that you get with one of those products. and they're huge money, right? They're this big, super expensive, to say nothing of the DLP products that are even in the field, right? And it doesn't matter if you're using Microsoft Purview or a dedicated version of the security product. They're in only the most premium of subscriptions for the enterprise, because they believe that when you tool this thing, it belongs to a very mature organization that understands sensitive data at rest and in motion. They have the ability to take time and energy to index and coach teams on acceptable use and set up, prevention policies. But that small companies just simply don't have that IT maturity to come to the game and do it. And I look at it and go, yeah, but you have this now super sophisticated analyst called a large language model that you could use to coach your user and educate them and co-pilot them through the use of why this data is sensitive, what risks it poses to the company, what are acceptable usages, why you wouldn't want to do this, right? You would never take the time with a person to do that, but you now have this tool not only to find it, but also coach and explain and walk people through it and bring up the maturity of an organization that's doing poorly at this. So, to take the steel man of why we should, we can, and it's very cheap to do it, right? It's a ChatGPT subscription is $20, and it could explain to you if you uploaded a file, is this sensitive? What should I do to safeguard this? What are some safe methods to freely share this with my friends, right? Like, it can do it now, right? So, I look at it as, we don't require a lot of, innovation to start activating some of these awesome things that are already on our shelf.
Yeah, very good point. Now, I guess, like, changing gears a bit. So the AI industry is moving extremely quickly now. We've been using AI forever, and it's been kind of a slow churn. And then ChatGPT gets released, and suddenly the doors get blown off, and it's everywhere now. But one of the really interesting things with the AI industry is in regulation, where it feels like it's one of the few where international governments are actually acting a hell of a lot quicker than I'm used to when it comes to technology regulations. Yeah. We're just now getting the Cyber Resilience Act telling manufacturers that, hey, the stuff you put out needs to actually be secure, or at least have a somewhat decent secure development lifecycle for it. And we've been putting out software for 60 years. But with AI, we already have the EU AI Act that's already been passed, for example. We already have even the US government, of all people, starting to look at potential regulatory opportunities, or in some cases, preventing states from regulating AI at all in recent bills. But I'm curious, in your experience or knowledge in this case, what kind of an impact do you think things like the EU AI Act or any other regulations in the space will actually have on both in cybersecurity from attackers or defenders, or just in AI adoption overall?
Yeah, if you look at the players in AI that are actually moving the needle, and that regulations about AI safety, right? The idea is that we look at the livelihoods, the disruption to the economy, that fourth wave industrial revolution that might put a lot of people out of work. You look at, obviously, the dual use, right? Nefarious purposes. If you can drive a car, you can drive a drone, right? If you have this concept of the information that might be leaked, or convince people to do awful things, right? Or 3D print race-specific virus, right? There's all kinds of other weapons that can be created here. And so the idea is that there's only a few players right now. While AI is moving very quickly, it's only moving in a few arenas, right? And a few geo domains, right? The US obviously is leading it, right? You have over 40 models that are very complicated here. We have a massive GDP. We have all the infrastructure. We've got a lot of the hardware, the software, the talent, the schools. So we're moving the quickest, right? Behind us, of course, is China, right? And you look at their 14 models, their ability to take the massive scale in companies like Alibaba and Huawei and everybody else, and sort of catch up, and DeepSeek and everything else. They're a major player, right? They're right behind, and they always get touted as the thing we should be afraid of if we don't do it responsibly. And then, of course, you have the EU, right? Most people forget that DeepMind was in the UK, right? That there was this concept of these wonderful research institutions and collaborative exercises that were advancing AI science for decades, sometimes under an American banner like Google, but always, at a research institution of some kind. And you look at them in terms of regulatory, and when it's the EU AI Act, right? The idea is that it's a joke, but America innovates, China imitates, and Europe regulates. But they also are leading the way in regulation. It is the single most comprehensive piece of AI regulation that we have, right? If you look at executive orders under Biden, when AI started to get a lot of traction in the news, the EO didn't have a lot of parameters around how to do it. And frankly, there was no federal statute or regulation or law that gave anybody from Congress to an executive order power to enforce anything on these AI companies, right? And they kind of have this sort of state by state regulation, which is, you talk about all kinds of ways in which that doesn't work. You have to go to a model that I think has been successful. And when you look at the EU, they kind of rely on this sort of learned behavior from GDPR, right? In 2018, when they released GDPR, they had kind of a consensus about the data, the privacy, and the enforcement, right? They had ICO offices, DPA offices. They set up the regulation. They gave people a year to react. And the model for the fining was quite severe, right? You had kind of a 20 million euro or pound fine, and then you had like a percentage of your revenue that would be, whatever was higher that they would hit you with. And they got massive amounts of money in the treasury by doing this, right? They could find Facebook in the millions and billions. They could find, Marriott and all these other companies, right? And you can go down the list and look them up. There's humongous dollars that were getting collected by the treasury to do this, which then, of course, armed them for similar. You talk about, industrial controls, sensitive industries, NIS2, right? This idea that it's the same fining structure, right? You have a 10 million euro and a smaller percentage in terms of revenue, whichever one's higher, but it's the same concept, right? They have already sort of built out this concept that you're going to have these enforcement offices that'll chase down the companies. And then now this EU AI regulation is very similar, right? It's actually the highest, right? It's 30 million euros and 6% of revenue, whatever's higher. So it's going to be pretty aggressive because they're much more worried about this. But when you look at the way that they've already kind of structured to enforce it, all the pieces are in place, right? So it's an August to August thing, right? So in August, it kind of becomes live, and then they get you till August of 26 to sort of comply. Very similar to GDPR, they give you a little wide berth to sort of put your AI practices in there. But how's it broken out, right? They talk about the models that you have and the sensitivity of the model to create destruction, right? So there's like a disqualified or a non-starter at the top, which is, you create a social security scoring system where you don't let people travel unless they're good people according to the AI. DQ, right? You don't get anything, or it's used to kill people. No, we're not going to do that, right? Down there, it goes kind of high, medium, low. They have a different name for it. It's like high, and then like, sensitive or something like that, and then not sensitive. But arguably, it's just sort of high sensitivity models, low, medium, low, which kind of goes to like high would be like self-driving, medical advice, a lawyer that's going to put somebody in jail that's an AI lawyer. They want to make sure that you're responsibly working on those things, right? So, the regulation will have a bunch of like, are you red teaming? Are you, talking about disclosures on time? And if you're not, boom, they hit you with the fine, right? And so the idea is that they're still relying on the Brussels principle, right? The idea is that they're still using, at this point, if you think about the EU as an 18 to 19 trillion dollar economy or whatever, they're sort of like tied with China in terms of like the second biggest economy out there. And they're basically saying, if you're on our shores, we're going to be able to hit you with this, right? But there are a lot of different examples in GDPR of this not working out, right? If you remember Brexit, there was a company in Victoria, Canada called Aggregate IQ that worked with Cambridge Analytica. They had this kind of like stolen copy of Facebook data to target citizens against this campaign to try to push for Brexit. And then when the EU said, you've misused our data, of the EU citizens, we're going to come and hit you with a fine, even though they were partnered with a UK company to do this, they obviously were in another territory. And so GDPR didn't have any enforcement capabilities, what we call extraterritorial fines, right? And this is not new, right? If you want to avoid US tax law, right, there's something called the double Irish Dutch sandwich, where you basically create two Irish entities. One goes to Bermuda. It basically takes all the intellectual property from Google. And then the other one basically gets billed for that intellectual property. And then that IP only pays 12% tax in Ireland. Flowing through a Dutch company, right? And so the idea is that there's always ways extraterritorially to kind of mess with this in order to avoid the jurisdiction. And I know our legal counsel here is going to say, I don't like this, Adam. What are you talking about getting around fines? I mean, as the CISO at Act Zero, when we talked about avoiding GDPR fines, this was part of it. It was saying, look, we're not incorporated in the EU. We don't have to follow these laws. Even if there are customers of ours that have this in-scope concept, they're not going to be able to hit us, right? Like there's just no rules that allow them to kind of come into our bank account or hold us, liable for, because our laws operate here and there is no law for that. So, if I look at the implications of this, it's going to probably go the same way that GDPR did, which is that it's going to hit companies that are incorporated or have something onshore that they can use to levy these fines against organizations. So the local office of Facebook is going to get real expensive. It's the same, other regulations that you see against Google and everybody else that are in the courts even right now, right? To this day, it's still talking about privacy, antitrust, et cetera. So, that's basically how it goes. And you see other countries borrowing from this model. Like Canada has, arguably a few research institutions. They've had this bill in the second reading of Parliament, which is like just before it becomes a regulation, that they kind of converted from GDPR. They just can't seem to decide. The EU had three distinct, right? It was GDPR, then NIS2 for the critical infrastructure, and this EU AI bill. The Canadian Parliament's kind of like mixing them all together, right? If you see in California, the Consumer Privacy Act, right? Like the idea is that you had this similar to GDPR type finding structure. It only kind of went up to $7,500 a record in the worst case. And obviously things like HIPAA and other things that we borrowed from federally and then regulation to talk about finding culture there. But a lot of people are looking at this EU model and saying, well, we can just copy this and that'll be our AI regulation. And I think that the premise for that is that if you look at adopting the regulation, that's nice, but you have to adopt the enforcement culture that the EU has put in place, right? These DPAs and other offices, the ICOs, that can go and hunt and collect, right? Because it's useless without enforcement. And I think that even though you look at like breach laws specific to each state here, there's nobody really chasing you down. At best, we have kind of the FTC that shows up at the 11th hour to be like, Facebook, you really did bad. Hit them with a $9 billion fine, right? And that's happened in the past. But it takes a lot for the FTC to come involved. It's a group of 1,100 or whatever lawyers, and they're busy with antitrust. They got their hands full. They're very politicized. So there's a lot that you could see coming down the road. But if other countries aren't going to adopt the same model, or they are going to adopt the same model, it's going to have to be in the countries that frankly have the AI models we're worried about. I don't see that happening in China. I don't see that happening in Israel. I don't see it happening, in Canada, even, where you do have a lot of AI research and models being developed that could probably pose a significant risk. And we just don't have that same kind of thing. So, extraterritorially, adopting it locally, who's going to get the best model? I think it'll be too slow for it to catch up to the rest of the world. We're not going to get to a global treatise on this that allows, like a cap and trade carbon concept of how we would sort of regulate AI. And that means we're probably not going to see a massive, change, except for they're going to hit the big guys, right? Like who's this going to affect the most? The American AI companies operating in Europe that are going to get the biggest fines. That's what we're going to see. We're going to see some newsreel about some, speeding ticket for Facebook, that Meta took all of our data incorrectly and used it irresponsibly and leaked all our information to somebody who found a 0 day that they...
No way that would happen. No.
Never going to happen. It's happened every month, but it's never going to happen.
So one of the other areas here, like over the last 3 years, it feels like every time I've seen like a funding notice from like a tech firm, they go, we just got our Series C and we're going to use all of it to bring AI into our platform. And it's like across the board, every company for the last couple of years, the things they've been pitching are how we're using generative AI now, or how we're improving our AI adoption here. I'm curious, like, is there any misconceptions about AI and security that you wish people would let go of, about like maybe its applications or benefits or even cons from it too? Like, am I wrong? Maybe all these are great applications and I need to let go of that misconception.
I mean, there's certainly, the thing with AI is that, it's such a large branch of computer science. And I think that if you look at where it can be applied, certainly in the Valley, there's probably been some funding that was either too early or too late or not enough to get certain things off the ground. You look at companies like Perplexity, you look at companies like, Google, Meta, Facebook, you look at, OpenAI, Anthropic, certainly, right? And you look at these massive funding rounds and you have people leaving those organizations, starting other companies, immediately getting, I think of like the Reid Hoffman and the Oracle, investment, this concept of data center build outs. The energy consumption, the network card, like the hardware specific application of this, there's certainly a lot of money being thrown at it because they truly believe there's a massive, dividend on the other end. But you look at the way that those things have maybe been applied correctly, and it's really, one of the things you want to do is once you build this innovation, you want to create a moat around it. You want to have some sort of secret sauce that prevents other incumbents in there from just copying your stuff and moving on. And I think that the longer that we kind of play at this, people used to use the moat. They are talking about the models and the efficiency of the models. That'll probably hit a ceiling. So there's kind of a misconception that like, you'll derive that there's an AI race and that there's a winning to the race, right? Because it's kind of like we never stop running, guys. So like when does OpenAI succeed at never having a competitor? And the answer to that is you don't win the AI race. You probably outrun your next biggest competitor, and maybe people use your model, but there will be an inflection point about the usefulness of those models that will be good enough. If I make an 8K movie with Google's, newest model for video and audio, and it's an 8K and it's starring all the people that I loved from the show I did, and they got a super cool model for copyrights, I don't feel guilty about it, and they put it out there, how much more do I need to innovate if my TV isn't going to go beyond 8K and my goggles aren't going to go beyond 4 or 5 senses, right? Like what is the next step to what the model is supposed to do for that specific application? And if I look at, I guess, misconceptions, it's that we kind of look at that race and we think it belongs to the PhDs, the data scientists, the hardware, the software vendors, these really plugged in people, and people kind of throw up their hands and sort of give up on it. And anybody that's listening to this, I want to tell you, it's not that complicated. You're not sitting in a position if you've got a college, certificate, or you're a high school graduate, or you're even just, you're still in high school, right? You shouldn't think that, oh, here's this big, fuzzy, PhD level, super arcane, esoteric, higher order science that I can't play in because I don't have $1 trillion and I don't have all the data and I don't have all this like market theory figured out to like which one of these is going to beat us. I think people kind of sit there and wait and they don't want to participate. And I feel like this is the greatest time in history in computer science, full stop. If you think about your career, or you think about the software we developed 10, 12 years ago, even 5 years ago, right? It was crap, right? Like it's crap compared to what you can do now. And I think that the greatest misconception I'd love people to disabuse themselves of is that the data analytics or the mathematics or the coaching that they give you in universities and a postgraduate degree is what's required for you to make any impact here. As a matter of fact, I think the more educated you are in data science or mathematics now, probably the less business application you really have kind of working. But if you're a technician, if you're working on a problem for a business today, get your hands dirty on the open source. Take a look at how these models are doing it. Start playing with these agentic AI systems because it's there for you to do it, right? And so that's the first and most important thing I'd say is like, we got to get this concept into more people's hands. This is not a race that is won. This is not a race that is ending. This is not a market dominance of players of 2 or 3 that will forever be the dominant forces. They might be leading the way now. If you think about the top 25, AI models, you might see Anthropic and OpenAI there for a few years, but this isn't the only race, right? This is not the only game we are going to play. You can still make a move here. And I feel like, whether it's cybersecurity or other applications, AI specifically, I think that's a misconception we have to talk about out loud. Because, people say they don't have a Harvard degree and don't work in the Valley and don't have $1 trillion to spend, and therefore they're not in the game anymore. They should not do a computer science degree. They should move on, right? And it's like, no, this is where a lot of attention is, but you have to understand that that's not permanent, right?
Yeah, that's good advice. I guess for the last question I have for you, another piece of advice. Like, let's say you encounter a new CISO, maybe they're getting pressure from their board to like start looking at applications for AI. You see all around organizations going headfirst into generative AI adoption, and even like, on the extreme end, like laying off entire development teams to replace them with AI assisted coding. So maybe not to that full extreme, but if you saw a new CISO and they were tasked with evaluating AI applications for their organization, like what advice would you give them?
The fastest route I've found for those things is new blood, frankly. I mean, I don't want to sound ageist here, but if you look at like what I've found, senior 10x engineers, they're not going to take a long time to learn something, but they are also going to be very critical of it because they're very vested in the idea that they're the smartest, best engineer at this particular type of programming and architecture and everything else. And I'm not going to say they're unwilling to learn, but there's going to be this sort of fear and slowness to it. I think if you throw, 3 or 4 interns, right, as a low cost setup and say, look, I've got these 5 use cases across these 4 different departments that I want you to completely agentic AI, build for us. Here's some dummy data. Here's a little lab. Do your thing, and I want to see progress with your ideas. You'll be blown away at how these digital natives are going to be able to disrupt your existing processes when it comes to that. And It's kind of funny if you show a 20-year-old Salesforce, they kind of vomit, right? They're like, what is this? You were using what? Like, this is the worst form-based database. People actually use this? And you're like, yeah, man,
man, that hurts. That hit too close to home.
It's the system of record for like 90% of companies. And you're like, well, if they were going to try to automate it, do you tell them, look, Salesforce has released AI? No, right? You'd say, look, here's something we do for customer relationship management, invoice and ordering. Here's how people are using the data entry. Is there some way you could like OCR the form and drop it into a horizontally flat, unstructured database that would allow you to do 50,000 kinds of analytics on it with an O3 model from GPT in 3 seconds? Yes, there is, right? And they're going to see it that way, right? So to the new CISOs who are like hoping to take the organization, there's this beautiful book by Sheldon Bell, who's the CIO of Coca-Cola. And he basically said a large organization cannot innovate by taking the existing processes and trying to disrupt them. They can't even look at like a mid-sized organization to do this. What you have to do is set up a very separate from the group innovation team, right? Your moonshot team, your interns, your lab, right? Throw them in the room and have them do these new things. Because if it's this disruptive and it's this, different than what we are used to, you're not going to be able to kind of create a project that's going to terraform the whole business, especially with systems of record or key processes that really would have the highest value. You're going to need to do it down here. So to the CISOs, and they're also worried about, our production data and our intellectual property and our customers and what if and this and that. The risk-adjusted basis for making those kinds of decisions is almost all flat, right? It's almost zero. So I think if you look at, the kind of lab science way of doing it, that's the simple, greatest, fastest way to do it. And then they can come back and present their work. Super enriching for the young talent that is in there, gives them something, awesome to be proud of, gets you out of the whole, risk of the production systems, and allows you to move very, very quickly experimentally with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome advice. And especially I feel like that's great for the young folks in there. Cause right now, just being realistic, some of the job market does look pretty scary for folks that are that fresh blood. But like you said,
yeah, we're killing these people. I can't imagine a more gloomy scenario than graduating today and reading the news or trying to apply on LinkedIn to 1,000 potentially fake job offers. If I look at our job is to keep the ladder up, right? We're not supposed to just cut off everything and leave everybody kind of out in the lurch. It is our responsibility as people to keep this thing going. And I think that, young people should feel excited that they're using new tools. They're a real company. They're getting great experience. There's a future in this. And I think if we just say AI is going to do it all with AGI, we don't know that that's true, right? There's no evidence that if we keep on this train, AGI will be born. And I think a lot of investors will tell you that. A lot of real good, AI scientists will tell you that. There's no guarantee that that's the outcome, right? But there is a guarantee that if you don't invest in the future, that it will dry up and they'll move on to something else, right? So yeah. we do need to start, I think, investing there. And I think it's a great place to get started is, hey, we're going to experiment with AI. We'll experiment in the lab with some new grads,
That's awesome. Well, this has been super fun yet again, Adam. I definitely appreciate you hopping on and giving us your insight on this.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So hopefully again, sometime in the future, maybe with the next turn or interesting innovation in AI, or maybe we can pick another regulation to do a deep dive on, since I know that's another one of your fortes. I know there's quite a few folks that have been asking about hot takes on FedRAMP on this podcast. So maybe at some point we can talk about that.
Yeah, we need. I would love an hour for just that. Is FedRAMP, defense regulation, government regulation around those types of services? 100%. I'd love to come back and talk about that.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Adam, and hopefully chat with you again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening.
Hey, everyone. Thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to me on Blue Sky. I'm at itsmark.me. Adam, I'm sure you can find him on LinkedIn. And WatchGuard is on Instagram, of all places, at WatchGuard_technologies. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week.